Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Adrian Scott Fine. I am the Senior Director of Advocacy for the Los Angeles Conservancy. Welcome and thank you to all of you for joining us today, to our members, our supporters. We cannot do this work without you, so thank you. Our People Plus Places series and the 70s Turn 50 initiative are all about shedding light on places and the people and stories contained within. And while sometimes ordinary, modest-looking buildings may not have architectural merit, these places can offer us extraordinary stories and an understanding of a different time and place, and also help us see ourselves within and how far or little we have come. With only 3% of all of Los Angeles's historic cultural monuments representing women's heritage, this means too few places are currently recognized and acknowledged in preservation. They are unknown and now often increasingly at risk. As the National Trust says through its Where Women Made History campaign, every place has a woman's story to tell. So today on International Women's Day, we intend to help do this by sharing some LA spaces and places that impart the 1970s for and by women. Speaking of, we have a great lineup of speakers who are all working hard in different ways to tell these stories, with Kate, Lindsay, Evan, and Sion joining us. So thank you for all of them for being here with us and sharing their knowledge and experiences. Our plan is to hear from each for a brief 5-minute overview, and then we'll break into a group conversation. This will then be followed by a Q&A period. So I encourage you all to please submit your questions ahead of time or anytime during the program. Put it in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to all of them. We should have plenty of time to do that later in the program. So please, we want to hear your thoughts and also experiences and also other places that maybe we should be looking at and working to preserve. We are going to be recording this program. It will be up on our YouTube channel later this week, so you'll have another chance to see it, but also please feel free to share it with others. And with that, we're going to get started right away. We're going to begin with Sion, followed by Evan, then Kate, and then Lindsay. So take it away, Sion.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Adrian, for being here. I'm just going to share my screen here. And hopefully everyone can see that. So I'm literally here going to set the context for our discussion today. And here it is, the cover of the Women's Rights Context, which was commissioned by the Office of Historic Resources in 2017. I was so pleased to be a part of the Historic Resources Group team that was selected and worked with my esteemed colleagues, Christine Lazaretto, Carrie Fowler, and Heather Goers to create a document that I really believe breaks some new ground in terms of understanding what women's rights look like here in Los Angeles. We worked, of course, very extensively with Janet Hansen and Sarah Delgadillo Cruz in the Office of Historic Preservation. And although we're going to talk about the 70s today, because that's the topic of this webinar, it is a comprehensive document that talks about women's rights from the very founding of the Pueblo, all the way through suffrage, all the way up until 1980 and covering second wave feminism. And one of the interesting findings, I think, from this work is that somehow we've all been kind of sold this conventional wisdom that it was Northern California that brought women's rights and suffrage to, and the right to vote specifically, to California. And I just offer this little tidbit in finding that women in California would have had the right to vote in 1896 if Southern California had solely been voting for it. It was Northern California that didn't quite make it. But that's a story for another day. Another day, we're going to talk today about second wave feminism and this 1970s. Okay, here. So you can't really understand what happened in the 70s without understanding a bit about the 1960s. The turning point really was in 1963 when this woman, Betty Friedan, wrote The Feminine Mystique, basically a manifesto for women everywhere who wanted something more than their husband, their children, and their home. It struck a nerve with women all across America, and in 1966, Friedan founded the National Organization for Women, or NOW, as we like to call it. Now, this woman, whose name is less well known, but is no less important, this is Virginia Toni Caraballo, who founded the Los Angeles chapter of NOW and served as its president for many, many, many years. It's important to understand that NOW was largely composed of white professional women. And as a result of that, there was a bit of a rift amongst the women in Southern California. On one hand, you had the NOW people, and then on the other hand, you had sort of the alternate movement, the women's liberation movement, which was composed of more women of color, people with civil rights backgrounds, and lesbian feminists. So lesbian oppression was a feminist issue. And it was certainly one here in Southern California that resonated. In fact, I'm proud to say that the Los Angeles chapter of NOW paved the way for it to be integrated into the national NOW platform. Los Angeles also took the lead in paving the way for the rise of Chicana feminism. It has its roots at Cal State Long Beach, where they not only had an organization, but they published Spanish language feminist newspaper and developed a very early women's study program. But basically what was needed was spaces for women to meet in, to places to have what they called consciousness raising sessions or RAP sessions, where women could explore their healthcare needs, discuss issues that ranged from violence against women to financial literacy, and where they could explore this idea that the personal is political, basically to open up about personal experiences of discrimination, share them with other women, and inspire all of them collectively to action. And the places they did these were typically rented storefronts. They were not purpose-built buildings. And as such, these buildings are often hiding in plain sight. They really don't give up their stories very easily in a windshield survey or if you're just driving around town. So here's a building we're going to talk about in more depth in a little bit, but one of the most important buildings in Los Angeles, the Women's Center on Crenshaw. Here it is, the site of the Bread and Roses feminist bookstore, which feminist bookstores were vital places for women to gather and obtain information, again, to network and get resources, and there was a handful of them scattered all over Los Angeles. This was the site of woman tours. There were a handful of feminist businesses that really catered to women, and this was one that was a travel agent who organized trips for individual women, for women, even helped find women to find travel partners, because you have to remember this is a time when women traveling alone wasn't really a thing. And this building will never give up its story about being the Los Angeles Feminist Credit Union. This is in Westwood, and they offered, financial services and loans for women who, after divorce, had absolutely no credit histories of their own. Their credit identity was completely tied to their husband, and therefore they had nothing and no way to build a history. And this is a moderately tragic 80s remodel of the 1975 location for the National Organization of Women, for Women. Now, this was not their first location. I don't even think it was their second location. I think it was their third location. But this is where Gloria Allred was president of the local chapter of NOW in 1977, 1978. Of course, the great feminist and advocate and lawyer. And she rallied the fight in the late 1970s for the final push for the ERA from this location. But this is why the women's context is so important. It was an opportunity to proactively find and identify buildings associated with these important second wave feminist advocates. One of the learnings from doing the context was how many of the resources and locations that had been associated with suffrage around the turn of the century had been lost, and it was important not to let history repeat itself. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to Evan to talk about the Women's Building.
Thank you, Sion. Let me get my screen share up. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Evan St. Charles, and I am a senior associate with Architectural Resources Group. Today, I have the pleasure of presenting on the Los Angeles Women's Building. The Women's Building is located at 1727 North Spring Street in the northeast section of Chinatown, near downtown LA. Originally constructed in 1914 to house the Standard Oil Company sales department offices, the Beaux-Arts style brick industrial building has been occupied by a number of tenants over the years since Standard Oil vacated it in 1928. In 1975, it began its new life as the Women's Building. The establishment of the Women's Building was the result of several years of activity by women artists who had been inspired by the feminist movement of the 1960s. In 1966, the first women's studies course was offered in the United States. 4 years later, artist Judy Chicago established the country's first feminist art program at Fresno State College, now California State University, Fresno. The women artists were quite active in the 60s and 70s. They were still largely overlooked in the mainstream Los Angeles art movement. In the decade before the founding of the Women's Building, only 4% of the work displayed in group shows at the LA County Museum of Art were by women artists, even though women represented a majority, or 53% of the population. Thus, the need for a public art institution representing the interests of female artists was evident. In 1973, Judy Chicago, Arlene Raven, and Sheila Levrant de Bretteville established an independent school for women artists known as the Feminist Studio Workshop. The FSW moved into the former Chouinard Art Institute building on Grandview Boulevard in Los Angeles in November 1973. The FSW named the new center the Women's Building after the 1893 Women's Building designed by Sophia Hayden at the Chicago World's Columbia Exposition. In 1975, the old Chouinard Institute property was sold and the Women's Building was forced to relocate. After considering a series of options, they chose the Spring Street property, which offered significant square footage at an affordable price. The FSW class of 1975 was charged with remodeling the 3-story, 18,000 square foot space. For many students, the renovation was their first encounter with power tools and the first time they had been empowered to learn a physical trade. FSW faculty believed it was necessary for students to have a direct hand in creating their space in order to develop a sense of ownership over it. During its occupation of the Spring Street property, the Women's Building hosted hundreds of film screenings, art exhibitions, lectures, workshops, theater productions, fundraising events, and social gatherings. In addition to the FSW, several feminist organizations and enterprises occupied the Women's Building, including the Women's Graphic Center, the Sisterhood bookstore, a branch office of the National Organization for Women, which Sion had mentioned, Chrysalis Magazine, and several feminist art galleries and theater groups. Beginning in the late 1970s, the Women's Building made lesbianism and the lesbian art movement a central focus, helping found pioneering organizations such as the Natalie Barney Collective and the Great American Lesbian Art Show. The 1980s represented a shift at the Women's Building to a greater focus on issues facing women of color. A considerable outreach program was established to foster greater collaboration with groups founded by women of color and to create exhibition spaces in underrepresented communities. The Women's Building enacted a protocol for affirmative action in board recruitment and hiring and increased sponsorship of writing workshops, art installations, and other events featuring the work of historically underrepresented women. The Women's Building helped lay the groundwork for greater inclusivity to be realized in the feminist art movement today. After suffering a series of financial setbacks, the Women's Building closed its doors in 1991. In the years since its closing, the Spring Street property has been temporarily occupied by artist lofts and has been used as a filming location. However, the building has also seen periods of vacancy and is generally in a state of neglect. Concerned by the building's dilapidated condition, as well as the potential threat of future development, the Conservancy hired ARG to prepare a historic cultural monument nomination for the building. With support from many members of the Women's Building, as well as the community, the nomination passed in 2018, ensuring protection and a design review process should there ever be a project or modifications proposed to the building. Now I'd like to hand it over to Kate.
So I'm going to be talking about the Crenshaw Women's Center. I'm Kate Eggert, a GHP DC. The idea for the Crenshaw Women's Center came from a meeting in 1969 with Joan Robbins and other radical second wave feminists about the future of the movement. They say there needed to be a visible, concrete place for women to go, a kind of nerve center, a place where women can meet and talk even late at night, a place where books and literature on women would be available to borrow and read, a place for providing sound, professional advice and counseling on all women's problems, and provide a brick and mortar umbrella for existing and future feminist groups. They wanted a place for central communication for all those involved in a woman's struggle to become full, human, and free. The consciousness raising rap sessions were the cornerstone for political work at the center. It was a simple act of a group of 5 to 10 women coming together to talk about personal problems, experiences, feelings, and concerns. For many, it was the first time they expressed their dissatisfaction and anger. From listening to other women's stories, women learned to see how social structures and attitudes had molded them from birth and limited their opportunities. The Crenshaw Women's Center would be a, quote, visible evidence that something was being done, bringing more legitimacy to the feminist movement. The building would be its own billboard, symbolizing for women in Los Angeles that feminist goals and women autonomy could be achieved under its roof. They chose a building that was easily accessible by public transportation and large enough for a main office, meeting rooms, and a library. And since most women's lives at the time centered around the home, it was important that the space be home-like. So, in Robin's words, a duplex behind an ice machine on South Crenshaw Boulevard fit the bill. The living room had worn-in sofas and chairs and was the main meeting room. The kitchen got a large coffee pot and small refrigerator, and the bedroom got beanbag chairs and area rugs with a big bookcase overflowing with pamphlets and books about women's liberation. The center's grand opening on January 9th, 1970 drew 50 women. By August 1970, more than 1,500 women were affiliated with the center. Carolyn Weathers, who was one of the original lesbian feminists in the lesbian feminist group, remembers the center this way. Every time I went to the center, I felt like I was coming home to a new kind of home, one that many women, gay and straight, had dreamed of but not found until then because it hadn't existed. Now the ideas and the fervor of the second wave feminism and of lesbian feminism had arrived, and its ideals and fervor were changing the world, changing it right there at the Crenshaw Women's Center. So she continues, here women met, plotted and planned, set up speaking engagements, demonstrations, a kiss-in. Everything was done by volunteers. One lesbian gave self-defense classes, another taught hands-on car repair. Posters, handwritten signs, and calendars covered the wall. In the kitchen, there was always a pot of coffee and a 6-pack of beer in the refrigerator. Have a cold beer, replace it the next time you came. Every Saturday night, we had a dance. In October 1970, we invited the Daughters of Panelists to our Halloween dance party. It was a meeting of the old and new, the conservative gay women and the revolutionary lesbian feminists. There was some culture shock, some bemusement, then there was dancing. I can close my eyes and see all those women dancing together. And this is still her speaking. Activist Janine Cordova, who was the president of the Los Angeles Daughters of Panelists, said later it was the lesbian feminist Halloween dance party that pushed her onto the path of revolutionary activism, sorry. And then there was Carol Downer and Lorraine Rothman, founders of the Self-Help Clinic 1, which ran out of the center's back bedroom. This clinic was the first in the nation. It placed the Crenshaw Women's Center at the forefront of the women's self-help movement. Downer explained the clinic's philosophy. The goal of the Self-Help Clinic 1 is to take women's medicine back into our own hands. The strategy is to take back the power over our own bodies. Downer and Rothman believed that control over reproductive rights with access to safe abortions and contraception was central to women gaining and maintaining self-determination. Here's some photos from Carol Downer showing cervical exams and breast palpation demonstrations at the center. Women's Self-Help 1 was constantly under police surveillance. Downer and staff member Colleen Wilson were actually arrested for practicing medicine without a license. Downer had applied yogurt to help relieve a woman's yeast infection. Downer used the publicity to spread a strong message to the feminist community. This trial is a direct threat to our rights to know our own bodies. This is a quote from her. We not only expect to win, but we also want to give emphatic notice to all who would deny us this right that we will control our own bodies. Downer was acquitted, but the platform and publicity of what was called the Great Yogurt Conspiracy raised the consciousness of the nation and helped make women's clinics a national movement. By 1975, there were 40 self-help clinics nationwide, and they all used the famous Los Angeles Self-Help Clinic #1 as their model. And when the Crenshaw Women's Center closed in 1972, the clinic took over both sides of the duplex and operated until 1980. So these stories can go on and on, honestly. You can visit our site or at ghpc.com to read our nomination. We did write the HCM nomination. It was approved at the Cultural Heritage Commission. However, the council voted to do a insight of, which is extremely rare, considering the building is still there. And I assume we'll talk about that. All right, and next up, I pass it to Lindsay.
Hey everyone, I'm so happy to be here with you all today and share a site that's really important to me, the Alcoholism Center for Women. So the Alcoholism Center for Women, or ACW, was founded by lesbian service providers and activists in 1974 as the first women-centered alcohol treatment program on the West Coast. And for me, this building is a tangible example of the way marginalized women are and have been agents of their own healing. The women at ACW asserted their existence in the public realm and confronted the larger social and political forces that shaped addiction. And they also turned inward and within the buildings cultivated new practices of recovery based in mutuality and self-determination. So here are the faces of some of the women that give meaning to this place. On the bottom right-hand corner, you have Brenda Weathers, the founding executive director, her sister and staff member, Carolyn Weathers, who Kate just quoted, and other early participants and staff members. Brenda Weathers was an out lesbian who had moved from rural Texas to LA in the late 60s and found herself in the thick of the Gay Liberation Front and lesbian feminists. In the early 70s, these activists turned to confront the systemic failures of mainstream institutions to care for women and queer people by building their own sites to meet people's basic needs of housing, economic security, and public health. The Gay Liberation Front formed the Gay Community Services Center, now the LGBT Center, in Westlake in 1971. Brenda was also a self-identified alcoholic at a time where most socializing for gays and lesbians took places in bars, and she really felt the gap in care for women like her. So she helped write a grant for a women's treatment program housed under the Gay Services Center. The center received the grant, the largest ever granted to a women's program, and shortly after, Brenda and other founders split from the Gay Services Center and founded their own organization, the Alcoholism Center for Women. And here, just a few blocks away from the Gay Services Center, became the home of ACW. These two Tudor Revival homes were built at the turn of the century during the early development of the Pico Union suburb. Brenda, Carolyn, and other founders rehabilitated these grand yet deteriorating buildings and opened an inpatient treatment program in 1153 Alvarado and an outpatient treatment program at 1147 Alvarado. ACW was part of a vanguard of early women queer-led peer support and residential programs that built self-worth, raised political consciousness, and fostered community belonging. ACW staff was an interracial majority lesbian group that included many recovering alcoholics. And they understood firsthand the need to center women's intersectional identities, sexuality, race, and class, and lead with trauma-informed care to get to the root of substance use. And they did so first by addressing these underlying issues of isolation and self-worth and marginalization that women experienced in other parts of society. So they had a lot of fun while they were doing it. It was a struggle to establish ACW in the first place, but also to maintain such a precarious site that they rented. In 1987, 13 years after the organization's founding, the owner of these two buildings attempted to raise them for a strip mall. This ignited a grassroots effort led by ACW's director, Brenda Underhill, who hired Christy McAvoy to nominate the buildings. They were approved as local landmarks for their architectural significance. And with the support of the Community Redevelopment Agency, ACW was able to buy and restore the buildings. So conservation has always been a part of ACW's story, starting with the founders' elbow grease in 1974 to make the buildings habitable, the fight to save the buildings from demolition, but also in really quotidian ways. Residents have daily and weekly practices of maintaining the buildings, of sweeping the front steps, and caring for the plants. And this is part of the legacy of the site. And for many women in the program, these homes are a direct alternative to incarceration, to medical institutions, or being unhoused. And so the care that they show for the house is intertwined with and a testament to the way that they care for each other. And thanks to the support of ACW's current director, staff, and alumni, I was able to hear directly from some of them about what this place means to them. So I'd love to end with their words instead of mine. And so you can see over the years, the resonance in the ways that people describe ACW and its role in saving their life and creating community based around love and healing. And again, the buildings themselves have been a really important site and home for women, but as many people say, it's about the community that was able to be cultivated inside that really is the building's significant meaning to them. So with that, I end it, and I'm looking forward to discussing with the rest of you all.
Well, that was awesome, everybody. Those are some great examples of kind of the breadth as well as the depth of resources that are related to second wave feminism. So that was really fantastic. I thought it was so interesting, that there are a couple that really do have kind of architectural significance as well as a couple that, are maybe kind of on the edge, more vernacular than anything else in terms of their buildings. So I guess that one of the questions I would pose to everyone on the panel is, what do we do when someone says, well, those buildings don't look historic? I know that that probably the Crenshaw Women's Center has faced that question about 500 times. I know back 5 or 6 years ago now, I had the great pleasure of doing a social justice tour of Los Angeles for the Preserving the Recent Past 3 conference. And one of our stops was the Women's Center on Crenshaw. And I made the group get off the bus and asked them to tell me of the 4 corners they were standing at, which one had the historic resource. And these were people who were really interested in the topic, and not a single one of them could do it. So how can we expect if people who really love and want to preserve these buildings, how do we convince someone who's maybe less inclined to do it from the very beginning? So I'll throw that out for anybody who has thoughts and ideas and experiences about that.
Well, I feel like I should start just because, I'm the Crenshaw Women's Center culprit writer. I think what our motivation has always been to convince people, to get people interested in the history just by itself, are stories, right? And then, you put it into the framework of writing the nomination. However, stories only get you to a certain point when it comes to politicians and developers. And, from there, we honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. I wish I did. I think that let the Crenshaw Women's Center be a cautionary tale, because what the council has done in making the building the site of, when it's still standing, the nomination, only the site of, let that be a cautionary tale for other buildings that aren't of architectural significance, but cultural significance. But in the beginning, you try to tie them in, you try to lasso them in with stories, but in the end, I don't know how to finally reel it in.
So I'm unfamiliar, and I'm sure there are others on this call as well, with the idea of it, the site of. Can you just say a little bit more about what that designation means? Is that a designation? I don't know.
I mean, I assume, yeah, it's the site of means you can demolish the building.
Okay.
And there, I assume, will be some sort of memorialization in a plaque in the lobby with photos. But that's it.
Okay. So it's really, I guess, just like, hey, we're supporting an interpretive program for this site at some
interpretive
level.
program, exactly.
Yeah, at some level to be determined.
Yeah.
Well, that is unfortunate, and I commend you for all the work that you did on that particular fight. I know that one of the frustrations that I had was at one point while we were writing the context, my phone rang and I picked it up and it was Carol Downer, who I had reached out to, who was like, it was like some celebrity was calling me. I was immediately verklempt and had to sit down, and I was like trying to gather my thoughts.
Yeah.
And part of what she was sharing was that that particular duplex, and I think you touched on this, was picked for the fact that it was a homey residential setting, that they wanted to make sure that you were getting away from sort of the male-dominated medical profession in a very sort of highly sterile, institutionalized setting. And so it's actually by design that building was selected, not by happenstance. And I never felt like anybody, except the advocates, really understood that particular aspect of it. But you raise an important point. What can we tell others? And I don't know if our other panelists have some suggestions or perhaps frustrations that they need to vent, but this is the place to do it.
Yeah, I would just have to say that I agree with Kate that you do your best to tell the story and make it personal and something that people can, feel like they can relate to or have ties to in some way, and hope for the best in some ways. With the women's building, like with the ACW, it was also seen as an architecturally significant building. So you have some architectural merit there that you're able to, people can look at the building and say, okay, I can kind of understand why that might be significant. But with these other more modest buildings, but were still very important to the way the organization functioned. And like you said, it was with the Crenshaw Women's Center was chosen for that specific purpose. It's a little bit more difficult to share and to tell that story.
Indeed. So one of the other questions that we can talk about here is, what did it really look like to have these like feminist-centered spaces? I mean, what in all different ways these buildings kind of exemplified that, and maybe you could just share a little deeper dive about what was the meaningfulness of consciousness raising in these rap sessions, and we now live in a time where I don't know, we don't need women-centered spaces, or we have them. Why was the establishment of these places so important for the women of the 1970s?
Well, I could start, and honestly, Sienna, I'd be taking your context statement was laid more than the foundation of the nomination of the Crenshaw Women's Center. But yeah, these consciousness raising rap sessions, as they were called, it was the first time these women, I mean, you hear these, they were probably hearing via the news, reading the newspaper, seeing these things, hearing these things, post-Vietnam. And finally, they get to go to a space, meet other women of just all different kinds of women in a group, and just be able to vent and be able to speak and be safe. So I think I'm wandering, but yeah, I mean, that was revolutionary for the time. It was maybe the first time for a stay-at-home mom who would be able to go out away from the husband and the kids, and be able to maybe speak negatively, you know,
Mhm.
and have other women to commiserate in kind of just commiserate. Yeah.
Yeah.
And just having that be really a revolutionary experience.
Indeed. I think that your point about them being safe spaces is really essential. If you guys want to build on that a little bit, or share other thoughts that you have.
Yeah, I think the idea of safe spaces ties into the range of different needs that were able to be met by these buildings. For Crenshaw Women's Center and Alcoholism Center for Women, there were some like real material things that women did not have, whether it like ACW provided housing for a lot of people, or organized for women who were incarcerated, or the self-defense classes that were held at the Crenshaw Women's Center. And I think that's also really helpful in bringing in women who aren't necessarily politically activated, not because they don't care, but because they're trying to make it through the day. And that once they're able to kind of have that security of their basic needs being met and not being in like a fight or flight mode, they're able to connect more and engage and put all of these things that they're experiencing within a larger political context, and also make friends and relationships. And I think that's where all organizing and like community building and self-determination comes from, is when you see yourself connected to someone else, and then you're not fighting just for a cause, you're fighting for someone that you care about.
Evan, did you want to share a little more too?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of build off of what Kate and Lindsay had said about creating these safe spaces, and spaces that for kind of to grow as your own person. I think that in the research that I had done on the women's building, this was in particular important for lesbian women, because they felt like, you know, even though they had straight women and you know, people who had families or had children who were coming to the building and, you know, needed the building as well, at the end of the day they left, you know, to go back to their children, or they weren't taking classes full time, or, you know, they had other obligations or other family, or, you know, the typical, or whatever you want to call it, family structure. So the women's building, and I would assume the same for these other spaces, were, I think, really important for women who might not have that that typical family structure or type of support to fall back on.
Well, I echo all of the things that you've all said. I would just also throw into the mix something that isn't represented here today, because it's nearly impossible to find. So when we were writing the context, it was ironically right in the middle of the Me Too movement, which was an interesting time to be writing the context. But it became rapidly clear to us that violence against women was pretty much invisible until the late 1970s. And by that, I mean both criminal acts such as rape, or you know, those kinds of aggressive criminal acts, as well as domestic violence. And it wasn't until the late 1970s here in Los Angeles that we started to actually see the development of women's shelters. And so it's just mind-boggling, I think, to think about the fact that in 1973 or 74, there wasn't a place for a woman to go who was experiencing domestic violence at home, or had been, you know, a rape victim. It just did not exist. And slowly but surely they started like coming into their own and being more supported. And so I think of what a great gift those safe spaces must have been to women at that time. Unfortunately, which I think also speaks to just the nature of those times, I couldn't locate any of them because their location was not public, because the women were always afraid of reprisals from, typically, and if it's domestic violence, their boyfriends or their husbands. So again, I give a call out to all preservationists. If you happen to find a building that was a woman's shelter at that period of time, that is a unicorn, and that's something that needs to be understood, because generations now can't even fathom the idea that there was no women's shelter or no help for them in the late 1970s. So yeah, that was a bit of a failure, but I just raised I raise the flag here so that everyone can be on the lookout and find and celebrate those types of resources as well. We have about 15 minutes or so left in the program. Adrian, do we have some questions from the audience that you wanted to take?
Do we? We have lots of questions for you
Okay.
all, which is really great. So I'm just going to read out some, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. Here's a question from Lena. Would it be fair to say that the activism within these buildings was largely driven by lesbians?
I don't, I think from the presentation, the lesbian feminists were a major component to the lesbian movement in Los Angeles. But no, I think it would be pretty, I think we ended up speaking a lot about lesbians in the women's movement, but and I think probably because they were part of the radical arm of the women's movement. So that would be
I'm trying to think holistically about some of the sites that we didn't talk about today. I don't get again, a very important component, but certainly there was a strong professional, college educated women's component. Again, women who had families who just really needed some respite from what the promise of perhaps maybe having worked during World War II, had a little taste of what it was like to earn your own income, and then were fired consummately from those positions when men came back from the war, and then it was labeled as a return to normalcy. So I don't think you can discount sort of the power of working women everywhere who wanted their own identities.
Here's a question for Evan. Someone's asking about what happened to the old Chenard building.
I believe it's still there. I'm not sure who occupies it, but I think that it's still there on Grandview, at least from what I understand.
Okay, great. And then Chris, this is Chris Morris, who's with the National Trust. Thanks for joining us, Chris. She is coordinating the campaign where Women Made History. She's asking the question about oral histories from all of these organizations that you're sharing in the places. Where is that? Is it at One Archives? Does it need to be assembled? Can anyone share a little bit about how readily accessible that is, and are there gaps that we still need to put together?
So I'm going to start off, and then I know that others here have had more contact, but back in 2017, there was we knew that there was going to need to be an oral history component of this project. And so I sat down and made a list of all the women that I wanted to interview, and slowly but surely and depressingly found that the vast majority of them had passed away. And I was shocked, to be perfectly honest. I then did my best to try and locate people and reach out to them, and we did get some calls. But I think that part of that is also that some of these names were lost to history, and hopefully as we're turning up more and more of the history, we'll turn up more interviews. But it was from my standpoint, it was really upsetting that what seemed so much like the recent past, there was so little to draw from.
And I'm just looking in the chats. Evan, I think Sherry Balke. Hi, Sherry. Sherry was, there's too much to say about Sherry. She's amazing. In terms of the women's building, I'm so glad you're here, but you shared that you think the building is a Korean church now, which is great to know.
Thank you, Sherry.
Another question from Trudy, our friend Trudy, is asking, okay, what do we do? What should we be nominating, protecting next? Is there a list of sites? Certainly the context from Survey LA is great. It identifies lots of places in there, but how do we focus, prioritize, build support so we have more success like the women's building and ACW, and less marginalizing like what's happened with the Crenshaw Women's Center, where we didn't get the political support, or they just didn't get it, to understand how important it is to save the place, not just the site of. So what are some places that you think we should be looking at or talking about or working towards?
Well, I'd like to see us do more at the intersection of the Chicana feminist movement and the 1970s, because there are a number of storefront locations that are still extant that are associated with that. There are also sites associated with African-American feminists, and I feel like a multiplicity of layers of history can help. You know, it doesn't always just have to be architecture. If we can show the intersectionality of some of these sites and communities and how they've transformed, that may be helpful. So I would encourage us to look there. But with every passing day, they are increasingly rare.
Okay. Another question from Leah. Do you feel the momentum and sanctuary of these places is unique to the period of the second wave feminism? Does this add significance to their preservation? And if so, how can these sites inform us about current cross-sector or intersectional community resources?
Wow. Great question. Can you read that one again? That was so complex.
I feel like I can answer the first part, but
yeah, let's break it down. And thanks, Leah. This is about the first part of the question is, do you feel the momentum and sanctuary of these spaces is unique to the period of the second wave feminism?
I would say so. It felt so, at least in my research on the women's building, that it was unique to this just feeling of kind of being fed up with the way things were and kind of the state of society. And I think the fact that, as Sia had mentioned, things changed so drastically after return to normal after World War II that that women felt more empowered to actually do something about it. And not that they weren't before, but it just felt like there was kind of that in the civil rights movement and these other movements that were going on at the same time. I think people felt that women in particular felt empowered to kind of continue and say, you know, what we need to be standing there as women as well, while these other movements were going on.
And at the same time, many of these organizations appear to be drawing from the past century. So I know that Sion talks a lot about this in the context statement, thinking about early sites, again, largely domestic spaces, because that's where women had more autonomy and agency, connected to healthcare, like the Rockhaven Sanitarium, or other sites around women's voting. And again, I'm butchering it. I'm gonna turn it over to you, Sion. But yeah, this idea too that Dolores Hayden talks about in the Grand Domestic Revolution, that sites can be adapted and changed in these ways that are sometimes subtle, but also really symbolic. The Alcoholism Center for Women, for example, all of the old domestic service rooms are now therapy offices, and how that really hierarchical space has been transformed in these different ways, that kind of crosses generations and is drawing from the early 19th century through now.
So a number of folks have shared about this idea that maybe starting with plaques and interpretation, it's a starting point. And also this issue of it comes down to money, which is why many of these places are at risk now. They're seeing, you know, like so many other historic buildings, whether it's from this era or this history, they're on valuable parcels of land. So how do we counter that? How do we elevate these stories so that they can have a fighting chance to survive, knowing that it often comes down to, you know, development pressures, but also this idea, is there a place for interpretation here that we could be doing more of so that people know these stories?
Well, Adrian, I would just say that I feel like there's an opportunity at some point when we all can go out and resume somewhat normal lives for the Conservancy to tour these places, the ones that are still there, maybe even some of the ones that aren't, just as a cautionary tale, right? Because until people really understand what they are and why they were important, you know, it's hard to get the constituencies of council members and such to reach out and convince, you know, their leadership. So I think, you know, this forum is a great first step in raising awareness and gaining interest. But, you know, there's no substitution, as I know you well know, for getting people out there to look at these things and to talk about them. So maybe that's something we can all make a goal for the next year or so, would be to do something like that.
Right. Those are the main questions, but I would invite, if there's anyone else in the group that has a question that they're burning desire to have answered or want to have the folks here talk about, please include it in the Q&A or the chat. There's a lot of good information that's being shared, which we really appreciate. We will be able to keep all of this as part of the recording. But I just throw it out to the panel. What's one place that has really motivated you, that speaks to women's heritage in Los Angeles? What connects with you personally, other than maybe the place that you've talked about already, but is there something else out there that we should have our radar on?
Well, I can only say I'm sick to my stomach about the Crenshaw Women's Center. That one was the one that when we were writing the context, I was like telling everyone I knew about that little building. And so that's not really an up with people story like I know you want to end with, but that's the one that I always thought would be the hardest fight, you know. And I guess to put an up with people spin on it, I know that when we were, you know, talking with the city about some of these resources in some of these sites, you know, our team was, you know, kind of painfully honest and say, well, you know, that some of these are going to be difficult sites, we'll leave it at that. And the city was 100% behind us in terms of making that a part of the story and not trying to sugarcoat it in any way, shape, or form. So I know that there's more out there. I'm overwhelmed by grief at this moment. Maybe you guys have others.
I think I would probably just echo what Sion had said. The Crenshaw Women's Center was one that, in doing my research for the women's building, came up regularly as being such a significant site in the 70s in second wave feminism, and to Los Angeles in particular, as being kind of this place of refuge. So
the only other one that I can think of, and I'm not even sure what the status is, to be perfectly honest, was the Sisterhood bookstore in Westwood, which was such an important place. I mean, this is where the women who were, you know, subject to domestic violence was go in there and try and find resources for how to get to a shelter. You know, as we talked about, there was all kinds of educational knowledge sharing, and that's what those spaces were for. And I'm not really clear as to what the status of that is. So maybe someone in the audience knows, but it was difficult.
In my research, I think it's still there, because I had a discipline, and that's how of punching in addresses kind of like once a month, and that's how Crenshaw was flagged for me.
Yeah.
For writing the nomination. So I believe it's still there.
Okay, that gets my vote then.
Yeah, it's in Westwood, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, great. I cannot thank you enough to hear you all share what you know, all the things I don't know and I should know. And I'm sure there's others that feel the same way. There's just so much from this era that we need to know more of the stories. And I think a number of people have shared to hear it from the people that experienced it too. That's what's so rich about this, to hear their stories. There's nothing that can come close to that. And Stian, you kind of bummed us out at the beginning. You said so many we've lost. So we need to start talking to the folks and hearing their stories, because that's powerful in terms of this. One last comment that someone made, and from Kathy Gudis, which no surprise it comes from Kathy. I totally agree with you that, you know, it's about the political advocacy is part of this. So we don't give up. We work hard. We're still working on Crenshaw Women's Center. Well, you know, until the building's gone, we will be working to try to keep that and make a case for it. And why can't it be incorporated as part of new development? We need to be creative and looking for win-wins. And that's what we do at the Conservancy, and so many others across the Los Angeles County are pressing for it. It's hard, but we need to do more of that. But I want to thank all of you again for taking part in this, everybody that's been part of this. I am a son of a strong mother woman. And in the 70s, she found her voice and reinvented herself as a businesswoman. So this era is so important for all of us, whether you're a man, a woman, or whoever, however you identify, it's all okay. But in terms of knowing these stories and understanding what it was like then and how it is today, how things have made progress, how things have slipped back, these places teach us really powerful stories. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and for everyone else that's been part of this. And we'll keep on and sharing the stories and advocating for these places and making their voices known. So thank you. Thanks to everybody for being part of this.